ci darei la mano.
Vorrei che non vorrei.
Nulla mi dirai di sì.
Hello everyone and welcome. I'm really excited to be here today and to kick off our events surrounding Don Giovanni. Our performances are not until the very end of April, first weekend in May as well. So we're getting a real head start on discussing this opera with you. It's a really well-known piece. It's also an extremely complex piece. So I'm really happy that we have a chance to kind of break it down with you, because we definitely don't have all the answers today and in future events. So I have two wonderful guests with me today that I'm very excited to have this conversation with. And in a moment, I'll ask them to introduce themselves to you rather than reading their official bios, which are very illustrious and long. But I also want to let you know that if at any point you have trouble hearing us or understanding what we're saying, please let us know so we can stop and correct that. If you have any burning questions or comments that you want to participate in as we're discussing, feel free. Otherwise, we'll leave some time at the end for you to ask us questions. So welcome. Melissa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. I'm Melissa Dunphy. I'm a composer who lives here in Philadelphia. I also have a sideline in local archaeology, particularly 18th century archaeology, which is only very tangentially related to Don Giovanni. I'm going to mention at some point Dunphy moved to Pennsylvania after. We'll talk about that a bit because it blows my mind slightly that he could have walked the streets of Philadelphia. I was a Mozart fanatic when I was a kid. I thought I wanted to marry Mozart one day, and instead I became a composer. I trod in his footsteps instead. I mostly write vocal music, choral, opera, art song, that kind of thing. Yeah, and so happy to be here.
That's amazing. I'm so lucky to be with these other distinguished panelists. My name is Julia Doe, and I'm a professor of music history up at Columbia University. I study music and politics in the 18th century, particularly thinking about the cultural politics of lyric theater. I wrote a book that's about how the rise of comic opera reflected and also inflected sort of broader cultural and social change in the decades leading up to the French Revolution. My work is mostly focused on French repertoire, but certainly the questions that come up in France are also very applicable to the operas that Mozart was writing right at that same historical moment. I also do a bit of work on women in music in the 18th century, and this question of representation of women in the 18th century is also, of course, very relevant to Don Giovanni.
Great. I guess I should say a little something about myself as well. Forgot about me. My name is Kass. I'm the scholar in residence at Opera Philadelphia, which mostly means that I get the privilege to host these sorts of events, give pre-performance lectures, and write materials for our audiences, both young and old. And I came to opera and Mozart as a singer. I still sing a bit, but I got really interested in the motivations behind the characters that I was singing and wanted to research how these characters were written, and long rabbit hole later, I have a PhD in music history and study this sort of thing from a lot of different angles. My undergraduate thesis happened to be on Don Giovanni. It was a singable English translation of Don Giovanni, which is terrible, really bad, but I did it in order to not just bash all of the other singable translations that were out there. I decided to bash my own as well. But really I did it because the characters in Don Giovanni, as we'll be talking about today, are full of such ambiguity. There are so many different sides to each character that it's really hard to translate the text in such a way that that ambiguity is maintained and you're not making a judgment about the character. So that's kind of my interest in Don Giovanni. In my doctoral thesis dissertation, I wrote about Lorenzo da Ponte and his later work, translating French operas into Italian for audiences in London. So I am a da Ponteist. Yes. So today we will be focusing on issues of gender and social class, kind of in Don Giovanni the opera, and kind of the surrounding context for the opera's premiere, as well as thinking about what do all of these things mean for us as audience members today, and performers today. I know we have some performers in the audience working on this piece, so welcome to you, and hopefully this can be useful to you as you prepare. First of all, I want to ask, how many of you are familiar with the opera, the characters, basics? Okay, not everyone. So let's give a brief overview. Would anyone like to start? Or I can do it. I can do it. I was just telling them I'm trying to write a synopsis for the Opera Philadelphia program, and it's so hard because so many things happen, and it's so hard to interpret what those things are. So here we go. Don Giovanni is an opera with the title character. Don Giovanni is a nobleman, and he basically goes around Europe trying to sleep with as many women as he can. That is his goal in life. Interrupt me if you disagree or want to offer a different interpretation, because there are many. So that is his goal in life, so that is the main character. And we meet in the opera his servant, Laborello, who kind of goes along with him and helps him with his schemes, but is also a little bit worried, knowing that what his master is doing is not quite right. He doesn't really stop him, but he's a little bit like, oh, I don't like what you're doing. And he's also kind of jealous of Don Giovanni. So that's a really interesting class dynamic between master and servant. The opera starts actually with Laborello saying, oh, I'm waiting outside for my master, and like I'm hungry and I'm tired and I want to go home. Like, I wish I could do what he does instead of what I have to do, right? So the opera starts off with this really clear class dynamic. We also meet Donna Anna, Donna Elvira, and Serlina, who are three women who Don Giovanni either has slept with or is trying to sleep with. That's the language I'm going to use. A lot of synopses say seduce. There's also a question, and this is a content warning that should be given for anything surrounding this opera. There's also a very strong suggestion or implication of sexual assault in this opera, and it's sometimes difficult to tell whether relationships are consensual. So that's part of the difficulty in just describing the basic story of Don Giovanni. So Donna Anna is an upper class woman. Donna Elvira doesn't come from the place where the opera is taking place, so we don't know quite where she falls on the class spectrum, but it seems to be like middle to high in terms of where she would fit in, but she's an outsider coming into the space. And then we have Serlina, who's often described as a peasant. She's a lower class character. So these are three different women, kind of symbolizing the fact, as Laborello says in his catalog aria, that Don Giovanni doesn't care who they are or what they do, as long as she wears a skirt, you know what she does. That's how the catalog aria ends. So he wants to pursue any woman. And so these three women are kind of representative of that fact. Three very different women, all of whom he pursues. And then we have a few men associated with these women. We have the commendatore, who is Donna Anna's father. He finds Don Giovanni sneaking out of his daughter's room and his daughter screaming for help at the start of the opera. He challenges Don Giovanni to a duel. Don Giovanni kills him. That's kind of the kickoff of the action of the opera. Donna Anna also has a fiancé, Don Ottavio, and Donna Anna asks him to avenge her father's death. So there's that dynamic of revenge and kind of family honor. And then there is Mazzetto, who is Zerlina's betrothed, who is also a peasant, and watches Don Giovanni seducing his fiancée on their wedding day in front of his eyes, and feels that he can't intervene because he is powerless in terms of his social station. So I think you'll see just in that kind of description of the characters and the basic plot, there are lots of really intricate issues involving gender dynamics, social dynamics, power dynamics in all different shapes and sizes, and that's what we hope to focus on today. Anything to?
And a cracking ending.
Oh yes, spoiler alert, yes.
A cracking ending where, I mean, spoiler alert.
Yes.
I feel like when you're dealing with a 250-year history,
Probably, you had time.
It's like spoiling the ending of Titanic, right? It's okay. So, the Commendatore comes and drags Don Giovanni to hell, essentially.
The statue of the Commendatore.
Yes.
A statue Don Giovanni invites a statue to dinner.
That's what it does.
As he does. And he says, okay, I'll come to dinner. And then the statue of Don Anna's dead father comes to dinner and is like, I'm going to drag you down to hell. I actually don't want to eat dinner. I'm actually here to drag you down to hell.
So with Leporello screaming from like, my master is going to hell, and that's it, like curtains, right?
And then an epilogue. And then an epilogue in some versions of the opera. There are different versions of Don Giovanni. It was premiered in Prague and then came to Vienna, so there are two different versions. But the epilogue has all of the other characters besides Don Giovanni and the Commendatore reflecting on what they will do in Don Giovanni's absence. It's like he leaves this hole. They're all like happy, but they don't know what they're going to do. Leporello says that I guess I'll go to a tavern and look for another master, and the other characters talk about whether they're going to get married and whether they're going to go home for dinner, and just like very like, okay, I guess life is going on, because this is the moral of the story is that bad things happen to bad people. So it performed with this epilogue, it's kind of a morality play as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure everyone can sort of think of, I can just hearing it now, and I first encountered this opera when I was a teenager, and it was just, I was in my high-key, I love Mozart phase, and now I'm, in my mid-40s, and it's 2025, and I'm encountering this opera in the current news environment and discourse environment, and I have so many different thoughts about it, and so many like, oh my gosh, it's like this, oh my gosh, it's like that, it's like this news story that's come up now, it's like, that person who is in the public eye that this is reminding me of, and I'm sure all of you are thinking those thoughts too and pegging it to different people.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the questions that I had is, what were your initial thoughts about Don Giovanni when you first encountered it, and what are your thoughts now? Because I feel like a lot of us have gone through this transformation that Melissa is talking about of like, I'm drawn to this in certain ways, and also like, what is this? Like, how do we address this? How do we teach our students about it? Julia, I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yeah, I do feel, in comparison to you two coming at this as singers and composers, I do feel that I might lose my credibility as an opera scholar, that I don't have a before and after, post Don Giovanni moment in my own life. I'm a violinist. I came at musicology through playing violin. I will say though, actually, I think my complementary perspective is this is a work that I have really had a journey with in the classroom. So I was probably introduced to this work for the first time as an undergraduate music major in the early aughts. Those of you probably who have studied this in the classroom might be thinking about sort of like, how is this presented in the common textbooks that we have about Don Giovanni? And I think there's actually not that much change recently, that sort of if you're reading about Don Giovanni in a textbook for college, it will sort of begin with the opening scene, and you'll have this catalog aria from Leporello that you have mentioned. Maybe they'll throw in the famous duettino for Zerlina and Don Giovanni, La Cidra and La Mano, who is one of the singers who could sing a bit of it for us. So my first encounter with this work was very much just here are these sort of extracts of this sort of jolly seducer, as it was put in the textbooks of the time, and not really sort of interrogated all that critically, but also just seen as sort of a static thing in the past that didn't necessarily have an impact on me as a contemporary person. But then, of course, encountering this later as a graduate student, and now if I'm thinking like, what Mozart should I teach to my students and how should I frame it, certainly I'm much more interested in digging into that complexity, dealing with those things that are of its time and also those things which are enduring, and also plugging into those places where the of its time and the enduring are in tension with each other.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a good follow-up to what Julia is saying. So the promotional material on Opera Philadelphia's website for this opera calls Don Giovanni, quote, a charming predator, end quote. Another quote, a man who uses people without a care for their hearts, and also as, quote, sleazy nobleman. And I'm curious what you two think. How much does Don Giovanni's identity as a member of the upper class play into his actions in the opera? So just a kind of constellation of questions to get your thoughts going. How might this have been interpreted by 18th century audience as a kind of social commentary of this like nobleman is going around killing people and possibly raping people, and what would audiences have thought of that, do we think? And also, do you think that these social structures that would have been very kind of front of mind for 18th century audiences can be easily received by 21st century American audiences like us today? I know it's a really big question.
17 questions.
I want you to take the 18th century thing, because you will speak with much more authority about 18th century audiences than I possibly.
Sure, I could talk about this a little, and I think Lily and I might have some places for debate coming from me as a French-based scholar, and Lily is knowing more of the Italian and the Austrian context. I mean, so certainly, if we think about what Mozart's Vienna was like, that was an incredibly stratified society. So about 250,000 people lived in Vienna at the time that Mozart was alive. So you want to guess how many of those people were noble? I like to ask questions that no one would have like a basis for the answer.
Yeah, 1,000.
Maybe about 3,000. So you're actually quite close. Yeah, it's a very small proportion of this very multi-100,000 person. It is literally the 1%.
All right.
Yeah, so in an opera in which Mozart is staging the complicated interactions of people from across classes, obviously that's going to have some kind of social resonance. And Don Giovanni, there are moments, and one of the funny tensions of this opera is, of course, there are moments when he is very interested in behaving honorably. So his interactions with the commendatore seem to rise to the level, sort of, or he's interested in these codes of etiquette when he's around the commendatore. So there are some codes of etiquette that he's observing as a noble person, but then also, obviously, places where he's completely transgressing those bounds in illegal, immoral, and unethical way. So certainly that could be seen as a critique of aristocratic values or a critique of this one person. I guess I'm kind of, the thing that I like think about in comic opera sometimes though is the complicating factors of demographics and the complicating factors of the sort of endings of the operas as we've talked about. So the question is, if this is representing some kind of critique of aristocracy or downfall of aristocracy, but who actually was the audience in France? The people who loved comic opera the most were the richest and most privileged people had that access. I studied Marie Antoinette, my favorite anecdote about Marie Antoinette is that after the births of each of her children, she had a private stage built in her apartments so that operas could continue as she convalesced. Wow. Like a super fancy Netflix. I bring that up in every possible public talk I get because I think it's a good factoid. But it does demonstrate, I mean, if that is the context in which a comic opera is performed, that comic opera might not have a super transgressive meaning, even if the content within it. And Mozart is a little more complicated, but we do know that many of his patrons were the who's who of the Vienna elite. And then it's also the question of ending, like how much are our characters changed by this experience? Is the end of this opera a moment in which the status quo continues or is transgressed? It's complicated. Yeah, but we could fight about it.
I don't want to fight about it. But I do want to mention that I think it's worthwhile, and maybe Melissa can chime in on this as well from your point of view as a composer, that like Mozart was really kind of between classes, and I would say so is Da Ponte. They both had a lot of friends in high places. They record conversations that they just casually had with the Emperor Joseph II about writing these pieces. So they definitely had access to the highest ranked people. But in terms of where they actually would have fallen in the social hierarchy of Don Giovanni, for instance, I'm not really sure what characters they would be most relatable to, or what they would have felt the greatest kinship with, because Da Ponte was everything throughout his life, from a Roman Catholic priest, even though he was born Jewish, to a gambler kicked out of Venice,
to a grocer in Sunbury, PA. Sorry, I'm just...
Yes, to a grocer in Sunbury, Pennsylvania, who thought that his enemies were chasing after him and making his teeth fall out. I need to read his memoirs. They're amazing. To the first professor of Italian at Columbia University. So he was doing a lot of different things in a lot of different places, and was really trying hard to create his own legacy, but he wasn't kind of high enough in rank that his legacy was assured, right? He had to create it for himself, and kind of same thing with Mozart. And so when I was thinking about social structures, I was like thinking about like, wait, but where do they fit in? And I'm wondering how you think about yourself in relation to the characters that you're writing. And
there is so much that is like 18th century specific, and I can't sort of say like, oh, we don't have an aristocracy, so to speak, in America. And we like to kid ourselves that we don't have a class structure, but we totally have a class structure. Oh, I want to sort of preface everything that I say by saying I am not a representative of Upper Philadelphia. I am a guest. So if you take issue with any of my political opinions, please do not yell at Upper Philadelphia about that. That is my personal opinion. I'm just going to put that out there. I don't want Upper Philadelphia's not going to get the flag. We have a class structure here in America. We have a sort of elite financial business political class who are sort of the powerful people in American society. This is also related to race and gender and all of that, but there are every day, it seems, stories about people in that elite class who can act in ways that people in lower classes would never get away with, right? And who don't face the same kind of accountability, and who can live this kind of life where they do whatever they want. They can have 27 children in a compound with 12 different women, and nobody is going to judge them for that, And we have the rest of us who are, even to a certain extent, stratified into a kind of middle class that can afford a house in the suburbs and a nice school for their children and healthcare and all that kind of stuff. And we have people in working class. And I think there's that reflection of it's not a perfect corollary, because things aren't perfect corollaries between centuries, but we can understand that difference. And then for me, like a lot of working artists, and I think, knowing what I know about Mozart, this ran for him as well, we often come from a middle or working class background, but if being an artist is what you dream about doing, at some point if you want to do grand projects, and what could be grander than opera with all of the things that opera requires: sets, venue, costumes, singers, and orchestra, all of that kind of stuff, you're almost certainly going to have to deal with the upper classes, right? And you're almost certainly going to rely to a certain degree upon their largesse, especially if structures like, I don't know, federal grants are being taken away. Then you need to actually rely upon a donor class and a patron class to support that. So for us as artists and creators of that music, there is this certain kind of line that we have to, this dance that we have to do, where you want people within your own class, and which is much bigger than 99%, you want those people to hear your works. That's your major audience, right? But you also have to cater to a certain degree to the upper classes, and what are you gonna give them? Are you gonna give them something that critiques them? How are they going to receive that? And I think to a certain extent, it's walking a fine line between, I want to write something that critiques the class system, critiques the people in the upper classes. I don't want to offend them to the point where they completely stop supporting the work that I do. And that can be a difficult dance, I think, for any artist. And I think, as a freelancer, it's like, you think that you can ignore all of that, and then you reach a point where you can't, you do have to play that game a little bit. And what you choose to do at that moment can have lifelong consequences. It's very difficult to, it's a difficult decision for any artist to make. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Thank you for that perspective. I'm wondering whether it might be helpful to further ground our conversation about Don Giovanni and thinking about conventions, right? Because Melissa said in her introduction, I'm not going to marry, I realized I wasn't going to marry Mozart, but I decided to follow in his footsteps, right? Everyone writing music at any point in time is thinking about who wrote music before them, what things they want to kind of borrow or take in terms of structure and content from these previous iterations, and what they want to kind of carve out as their new direction, I imagine, yes. So conventions in Don Giovanni, 18th century opera in general, and I think Julia can speak to this, are really strong, right? There are certain kind of stock characters, sometimes based from the commedia dell'arte tradition, of, the old servant or the pretty young girl, or, if we think in terms of modern cinematic tropes, right? The girl next door, yes, the ingenue. So there are those kind of character conventions, and then there are also musical conventions. And a lot of these musical conventions are actually tied to ideas of class and also sometimes gender. So I was wondering if, maybe Julia, you can start us off if you don't mind, if we could just reflect a little bit about what these conventions were, kind of how Don Giovanni interacts with, typically how 18th century operas are written.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could spend, I won't, because it would be very pedantic of me, but we could spend hours talking about 18th century convention. Yeah, when you went to the opera in the 18th century, you just had an expectation that you would have expectations that would be fulfilled, that what you saw would be in negotiation with a whole host of musical tropes and a whole host of dramatic tropes, and how the composer engaged those conventions, whether fulfilling them or subverting them or some mix of that, would be all part of the game, part of the fun. And I think in Don Giovanni, or in 18th century comedy, more generally, we're operating at maybe 3 levels. So on the one hand, we have the biggest umbrella, which is genre convention. Is this a opera seria? Is this a serious opera? Is it a tragédie lyrique in French? Or is it some kind of opera buffa or opera comique, a comedy? And you're going to expect that the characters and the situations are very distinct in those 2 realms. Probably the biggest point of contention about genre titles in Don Giovanni is that it has this sort of ambiguous, the drama giocoso, that is it a jocular drama? How much is, we don't necessarily see that many comedies in which there are sort of violence and dragging down to hell at the end. So there is certainly this question of what are the comic and the tragic doing together? How do they interact? Then one level lower, or sort of like more specific, we have this idea of character and aria type. That is, if you are an aristocratic character in an opera, you are supposed to sing in a certain way. If you're an aristocratic woman, for example, you might have an obbligato recitative that goes into a multi-partite song form, and you might have more difficult virtuosic music to sing, as opposed to, say, a servant class character is more expected to sing in what we call like a strophic form, the idea that for a stanza of text you would sing the similar music repeating, and there might be less virtuosity involved. And then sort of even more localized within Mozart's are all sorts of gestures that reflect status and class. So for example, what we would call a compound beat, or a sort of lilting 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, is more associated with sort of rural spaces and pastoral spaces and lower characters. So every single piece of music is interacting with this huge web of convention. And I would say some characters, and you can say this more specifically, are very much to type. Like Leporello, for example, behaves as you would expect. He sort of acts as you would expect. He sings the famous catalog aria we've referred to as a stereotypical sort of bass aria in a comedy. Figaro has one very much the same as aria, faux pretension, they say, sort of faux expertise, long texts. Whereas maybe Don Giovanni himself is a little harder to pin down. Some musicologists call him just a cipher. That is, that he doesn't necessarily always stick to one musical language, but adjusts his language depending on who he's speaking to. And I think that's on purpose. He's a little slippery, he's a little duplicitous. You can't quite tell how you should interact with him. Yeah.
My favorite fun fact about the character of Don Giovanni is he, and this is coded in the music, so you might miss it on a first listen, but he reuses a pickup line. Not the text, but the music. He sings the same music in seducing Donna Elvira as he does seducing her maid. In his aria and in that trio. I think it's just really good representation of how sleazy he is. Melissa, did you want to speak to conventions and how you think about conventions kind of as a composer and how that might compare to the 18th century context?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of similarities. Conventions are a shorthand way of, there's already a language out there for what audiences will pick up. And sometimes it's very conscious and sometimes it's almost subconscious. So, this idea of what represents upper class, what represents lower class, and from a compositional perspective, it's a really great shortcut to getting your point across as quickly as possible, so then you can dig into at least what I feel are the meat of the composition, which is emotions and motivations and characterization and all of that kind of thing. If you can really quickly shortcut it to like, oh, this person is that, then we can move on from there. And I know Mozart is using that sort of stuff. I used to do a lot of Shakespeare on stage as an actor, and you see that a ton in Shakespeare as well, with language and dialect and accent and all of that kind of thing. Even things like costumes have become conventions for, how we instantly perceive people. To me, it's an easy way of not having to teach the audience an entirely new language and doing a ton of exposition. You just instantly go, oh, we're gonna sing this kind of song. I now realize what this character is and what they represent on the stage.
Oh, thank you. That's a really useful framing, I think, is the kind of shorthand, and also, thinking about audience expectations. I'm trying to think what. I just want to make sure that we'll have time for things. Well, okay, so what I was thinking is we were talking about these conventions as this kind of shorthand and to make things simple for the audience. One of the ways that these things are then complicated for the audience, because we don't want it to be too simple, right? Then the audience would be bored, right? So you have to kind of mess with conventions a little bit. And one of the conventions that messes with the conventions is disguise, right? So you have the nobleman, you have the peasant, right? But then what happens if they dress as each other, right? Then it all gets switched up and interesting. So there are, I'll just give a little context of a few moments of disguise in this opera, and then I'd love to discuss like what that means in terms of the conventions and in terms of our understanding. So first, Don Giovanni is masked at the beginning of the opera or disguised in some way, depending on costuming conventions. This looks different in different productions, but the main point is that no one knows who has snuck into Donna Anna's bedroom at the beginning of the opera and then killed the Commendatore, Donna Anna's father. So they know someone has done this, there are witnesses to this act, but because he is somehow masked or disguised or something, some productions have like a hood over his face, they don't know who it is. So it's partially, there's a little bit of like a mystery type thing happening throughout the opera as the characters kind of figure out like, oh, this guy, we thought we were friends with him, but like, actually, who is he? And like, is he a murderer? So that's the first masking. The characters kind of band together once they realize that Don Giovanni is the one who has killed Donna Anna's father, and he has upset the other characters' lives in various different ways through his scheming and attempts to sleep with the women. And so Donna Elvira, Don Ottavio, and Donna Anna come together and basically crash Don Giovanni's party. They're not invited. Serlina is invited and Mazzetto is invited, but these other characters aren't invited, but they come to the party, and how they get in is they are masked. No one knows who they are. They say, hey, can I come in? And they're like, oh, charming masked people. Yes, please come and join us. So they come masked to the party so that they can spy on Don Giovanni and see what he's doing. And they, in that scene, kind of help Serlina when she is being sexually assaulted by Don Giovanni. So that's the second case. And then the third case is Leporello and Don Giovanni, so servant and master, switch clothing in Act 2, dress up as each other, and this is so that, let me get this straight, Don Giovanni, who is the nobleman, dresses as his servant Leporello because he is interested, he's already seduced Donna Elvira, he's now interested in Donna Elvira's maid, and so he's like, if I'm dressed in lower class clothing, I might be more successful seducing this maid. Meanwhile, I want you, Leporello, to pretend to be me because you need to get Donna Elvira away and out of the way so that I have space with the maid, right? So they dress as each other to fulfill this dual purpose of getting Donna Elvira out of the way and getting to her maid. So disguise is pretty common in 18th century opera, and kind of opera in general, I feel. What is it doing? How should we think about it? And does it read for 21st century audiences?
So interesting. I mean, it is true that opera involves so much suspension of disbelief, and oftentimes the masking is the disguise elements are the things that are sort of hardest. Well, why don't these people recognize these people that they've met multiple times, especially in these late Mozart da Ponte operas, in which a lot of action unfolds in this dark nighttime spaces. So I don't know, perhaps it's sort of a metaphor in itself. But that question of taking on the music of someone else becomes so important in so many of these operas. So it's almost as if the music is the disguise, even if we're not entirely convinced of how these people are pretending not to recognize each other on stage, I suppose. There's very interesting, so you were mentioning sort of the moment of disguise and wooing of Don Giovanni in that moment of the serenade. There's a new book by Richard Will, I don't know, maybe some of the students have read this, called Don Giovanni Captured, that's about the performance history of that opera, that talks about how some of the love songs of Don Giovanni, which in the opera are just completely deceitful, were marketed sort of early in the 20th century as like love songs, and the back would be a single that would be, an actual love song, a very very explicitly so. So this question of like disguise, like the music is the disguise, the music is the love song that's not really a love song. So that's sort of how I think about it. It's like, what is tricking us? Yeah.
It happens with opera so much.
Yeah, there's a lot of mistaken identity. Yeah.
There's so much, yeah. Like Onyema Bino Karo, like is one of those songs which, you know, people think is this beautiful, heartfelt thing, but if you look at the context in the opera, you're like, oh, not at all.
Yeah.
And same with so many of these love songs. But then that maybe, you know, is part of it, is the composer and the librettist, you know, they want to make it a successful disguise, and then removed of its context, it seems quite sincere, but it actually isn't within the context of the show, which makes it, you know, cooler. I mean, I also think that with regard to suspension of disbelief, we all buy that Superman is not recognized as Clark Kent. And we all buy that Spider-Man, that, you know, Peter Parker gets away with it, even though it's like, how are you not able to know? In the movie, it's really plain. What is going on here? So, but we're used to doing that. I think that sort of maybe keys into a sort of culture-wide idea of people can pretend to be who they really aren't. That also, when we think of, like, you know, this is tangentially related, but, you know, we think of people who we discover, our friends who we discover have done something terrible, and then whenever, I watch a lot of true crime, and whenever they interview the friends and family, you know, it's like carbon copies of the statement, I would never have believed that this person could do that. There's no way that, you know, this is my best friend. There's no way that he murdered someone. There's no way that he assaulted someone, etc., etc. And I think that this is sort of almost a way of processing that human beings can present these different faces at these different times, and that people will buy it. And from the outside looking in, it almost is like, how can they be so stupid to believe that? But we also all have incidents in our lives where people turn out to not be who we thought they were. So I think in some ways it's art processing the emotions surrounding that.
I love that idea. Yeah. I also just want to bring in another piece of historical context which might help us understand this idea of disguising and especially masking. If anyone's ever been to Venice, you know that they sell masks everywhere. It's part of Venetian culture, and it comes from a tradition Carnival, a time in the Christian calendar, where people are really celebrating, going all out celebrating ahead of Lent. And people would mask in these celebrations, which just sounds like a fun party trick to us now, but it was really profound because everyone of all different classes would mask and then intermingle. And no one would know, like, oh, this is Lord someone, or this, you know, this person has more money than I do, or, you know, this is the person who sleeps on the street corner, right? Everyone was kind of made equal in a certain way by everyone disguising themselves. And I think that's the kind of interesting thing to think about in reference to Don Giovanni, and especially how members of different classes in Don Giovanni are interacting, and really, especially with the women in the opera, I think they kind of form like this pack of solidarity, that, you know, us being women and women who are being treated badly by this man kind of overrides the fact that we wouldn't really interact in our real lives, right? So it's the same sort of like, what is the equalizing factor, and disguise can kind of help with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's bringing up as well, thinking about modern stories of like Me Too solidarity, and how so often the first wave of people coming forward, they have to be anonymous. Like, we still judge women for, for being victims of sexual assault, for coming forward for sexual harassment and things like that. And so it's almost like the modern version of a mask is that I'm going to be anonymous, I'm going to come forward in the press, but I'm not showing you who I am. So then, once it reaches a certain point of solidarity, at least in modern incidences of this happening, it might reach a point where they do feel confident enough to come forward and interact with each other. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know. It just occurred to me.
No, that's really, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah,
just like the idea of being anonymous, that is something that still happens in different contexts. Lily's taking notes.
I'm taking notes. I have so many other talks about Don Giovanni. I have to mine. The whole purpose of this is to just mine your brains in public for information for my future talks. I shouldn't have revealed. See, I'm one of the people you thought I was your friend.
She's actually a cutthroat academy musicologist.
Never trust musicologists.
Musicology is a blood sport. I've said it for years. It's cutthroat, it's vicious. As a composer, it scares me to death.
That's why we sat her in the middle so we can sit down and turn as scary as possible. Are you okay opening it up at this point? Yeah. I want to make sure that you have a chance to ask whatever you'd like to ask or comment on whatever you'd like to comment on. I have some more things that we could talk about, but does anyone have anything they'd like to bring to us? Yes.
I read that Don Juan was the basis of, and was Don Juan a Spanish song originally, and how would that have gotten to Mozart, and how would he have used that?
Yeah, great question. So Don Juan, we don't really know where the story originated. It seems to be some sort of like folktale-like thing, but there are many, many, many different versions. There's the Molière, there's a Spanish play, there are many, many different iterations. By the time we get to Mozart and Da Ponte, their point of reference, they would probably have had several points of reference. One was a Gluck ballet of Don Juan that was performed in Vienna around the same time. And there was another opera of Don Giovanni, written a year before, and Da Ponte plagiarized a large part of the libretto for this. I say plagiarized as like a modern concept. In the 18th century, copyright wasn't really a thing. There were many different ideas about what it meant to be original. But even at the time, people were like, huh, this sounds really similar. That still happens in Hollywood. So there was a very direct link to an opera that had been performed the year before. The music is quite different. Some of the characters change, but a number of the kind of big moments are the same across those two operas. So the other connection that I will say is a real life figure of Casanova, Marina Casanova, who famously wrote about traveling around Europe, seducing as many women as he could. And so Da Ponte knew Casanova. There are some reports, and I don't know how well substantiated they are, that Casanova may have even written little parts of the libretto of Don Giovanni. Not sure, but he seems to have been somewhat of a real-life inspiration for Da Ponte's painting of the Don Juan character, Don Giovanni. So it's kind of like this almost mythical figure from folktale, finds a parallel in a modern-day figure in Mozart and Da Ponte's time, and they kind of amplify each other, and that becomes the Mozart Da Ponte character of Don Giovanni. Does that?
I have to wonder, and it's amazing, it's maybe not the word, it's interesting that he's in the news right now. Does anyone know who Andrew Tate is? those who don't, he's the sort of internet pickup artist who has this extremely Don Juan, like, you know, I've slept with thousands of women can't resist me, I've slept my way all over Europe and the UK and the US, everywhere I go. And then he was caught for sex trafficking in Romania, and very recently Romania lifted the sex trafficking ban, and I think he's returned to the US, and now DeSantis is in the news saying we don't want him here, but it's like weird, right? But it's really interesting because I have to wonder if he would even exist, if pickup culture would exist, like if we didn't have this cultural archetype of the quote-unquote charming predator who sleeps with thousands of women, and that's good. You know what I mean? He's absolutely, it's like he's modeled his life after that trope, and come up against the same kind of issues that, you know, that Don Giovanni comes up against in the opera, where people band together against him and try to hold him to legal account, and then, you know, gets a sort of comeuppance, and we judge him the same way, but there are also thousands of people who think it's kind of cool, right? And that, I think was potentially as true in Mozart's time as it is today, as there are, you know, that there is a thing with the charming predator, where some of us are like, that's disgusting, but can also find him fascinating enough to want to follow the exploits and read all the new stories about them, etc. And some people are just like, life goals, right? So yeah.
Well, it certainly became a trope. I mean, there's Don Giovanni in the 18th century, and then there's Don Giovanni in the 19th century, which was a whole other sort of romantic trope of 19th century writers, indeed sort of glorifying what was heroic about this figure. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. We also have, lots of people asking, is Don Giovanni a hero? Is he a villain? And it seems from what we've been saying, the way we've been talking about Don Giovanni, I saw a number of you, when I said hero, be like, what? How could he possibly be a hero? But there's this, the philosopher Kierkegaard actually wrote about Don Giovanni as this kind of like life force. There's this kind of magnetic quality to him that does seem attractive, and I think part of it is what we were talking about with the disguise of the music, right? We can't tell, like, is he really sincere? Is he not sincere? Like, it seems from all of the context that he can't possibly be as sincere, seducing every single woman. Like, is he actually madly in love with each and every woman and his long list? Like, that can't possibly be, but he really sounds like he is. You know, there's this, we're supposed to be kind of both attracted through the music and repelled by his actions at the same time. And I think 18th century audiences and 21st century audiences kind of all would have felt that. And it's kind of uncomfortable to sit and like, oh, I'm really enjoying this opera, or for an opera company to be like, this is gonna sell tickets, like, we really like this piece, like, we're gonna do it, when there's so much discomfort and these things are still happening in the world, as Melissa was saying, but there's something that we just keep on returning to the piece, we keep on returning to the character. Anyone else wanna ask us something, add something to this conversation?
I think it wouldn't be as interesting if he wasn't so charming.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, if he would actually, like, you could tell instantly that he was, you know, ill, it wouldn't be interesting. And there are certain people, you know, in the news right now that I sort of think, there's no way I would fall for that. But then you don't know when you meet them how charismatic they are. I've had this experience actually, even in, you know, I haven't met any emperors, unlike Mozart, but I have met some politicians in my time who are very powerful people that I disagree with, or something, you know, or that I'm like, I don't think I'm gonna like that person. Then I meet them and they have this, the kids call it Riz, right? But you meet them and you shake their hand and you're like, oh, okay, I feel that power coming off them that's maybe also connected to their class and their actual power in society. But they also, their personality is that they will charm you even if you know that this is wrong. And it's interesting and a very dangerous thing, and I think watching something about that is far more interesting than, oh, here's this gross, rapist that goes through society and he gets his comeuppance at the end. It's much more interesting for an anti-hero to be both attractive and repellent at the same time.
And it also just goes to show how sort of sensitive and creative an opera production company will be in sort of choosing how to bring this to the stage, because the decisions you make about how to stage Don Giovanni will very, very much influence how the audience is receiving this, how they're seeing these messages. And I'd say this is an opera that's gotten bleaker in its stagings over time. Certainly that a contemporary production of Don Giovanni is much more despondent and than something that would have been produced maybe 50 years ago. And certainly the question of sort of what is his motivation? Is this, his own psychology? Is it a social problem that's causing this? Again, this sort of things musicologists have written about. So there's so many choices that Opera Philadelphia will make when staging that will really change how we feel about this question.
I will add that oftentimes when we think about productions kind of influencing audience interpretation, we're thinking about the visual elements, like what costumes are the characters wearing, what's the makeup, what does the disguise actually look like, what's the set, does this character look like someone we know in popular culture, right, things like that. But also musical performance often changes. With opera production, it's usually in quite subtle ways, because usually opera companies don't want to mess with the score or the words that the singers are singing. But I've noticed in some of these more contemporary productions that are darker, the tempos slow down, which takes the humor out of the music, in addition to the dim lighting and the leather jackets and the chicken nuggets and the finalists. I'm thinking of the Peter Sellers production, check it out. Identical twins play Moderator and Don Giovanni in that production as well, which makes the disguise actually work for the only production I've ever seen where the disguise actually is believable.
They found the solution.
Yes, they did find a solution. I think we need to think about what all of the elements are that are influencing our interpretation. Also the super titles. That's the cross I will die on. Is the super titles are important. What the audience is reading in terms of the word choice is important. The tempi are important. The articulation is important. Right? Every element will help influence the audience and how to interpret these characters.
Tempo is super important, actually, because if you've read any theory at all on comedy, it's all about timing. So in order for something to be funny, you could have the funniest libretto on God's given earth, but if the composer doesn't understand funny, they're going to mess up the timing and it's not funny anymore. And then the third level, of course, is the performer has to understand comedy in order for it to be funny. So when you mess with any of these kinds of elements and mess up the timing, you can turn something that on paper is like you're dying with laughter into something that is completely not that at all. So, choosing, and the company has to choose, and of course, Mozart was good at funny. Even when it's in a different language, I still think Mozart was really good at funny. I love diagnosing Mozart with all kinds of that's a guy with ADHD who just is funny all of the time to disguise his own insecurities. I feel like I can tell in his letters where he's writing the rudest, most base jokes, whatever, to his mom. I'm like, yes, I get him. And he puts it all into his operas. He's funny in his operas. So figuring out how to interpret that with a modern lens, is it okay for bits of Don Giovanni to be funny? And I feel like we should give our audiences credit for being able to pass through the morality of that. I love really black humor shows on Netflix or whatever, where all the characters are actually awful people and you know it. you know, it's like White Lotus on HBO or something, you know, so all the characters are terrible, and you know they are. And quite often they do turn out to be morality plays in the same way, where people get their comeuppance and then you get that kind of justice high of like, yeah, I knew that guy was gonna die.
So I was wondering, I've never seen the play or the opera Don Giovanni, but you had talked in the beginning about how some of the characters in the English translations can be difficult because it's hard to know the complexity of the character. You talked specifically about Don Giovanni, but I was wondering, since we'll only have two of those, if you could talk a little bit more about some of the other characters. I know you said the story is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, so, and I will say that this will have to be our final question for the interest of time, but anyone else who wants to speak with us, we can stick around for a while and speak with you privately. Yes, the other characters, the ambiguities, one of the main things is Donna Anna. Well, basically all the women. Maybe the main things is, and this really sounds like the Me Too movement, is whether the women are telling the truth about what Don Giovanni has done to them. And that is something that is very much not clear it's not clear in the libretto what Don Giovanni has exactly done to these women, because a lot of these, all of the scenes that would be relevant take place off stage. So Donna Anna's interaction with Don Giovanni happens before the opera starts. We see them bursting onto the scene after whatever has happened. Donna Elvira comes to the city chasing after Don Giovanni. So we don't see them interacting before that. And Serlina, we see in La Città Ramana, the famous duet, the kind of seduction scene where he's like, "Come with me, I will marry you, and we'll go to my nice house." Did you like my Don Giovanni voice? Thank you. But in the party scene, Don Giovanni kind of takes her away from the crowd, and then we just hear her screaming for help, and we don't know what has happened off stage. So in all of these instances, except for Serlina, really, in the other two instances, Donna Anna and Donna Elvira, the women tell their stories. They say, "I remember this is what happened to me." Donna Anna's especially is very explicit. Like, you put one hand on my mouth, with the other hand you help. It's very disturbing. And she also says, and then at the last moment when I thought I was lost, this is the language that she uses, I was able to break free. So in her telling, the sexual assault was never consummated, I guess. But then there's the question of, is she saying that to preserve her kind of respectability? That's one thing we didn't get to talk about today, but that's a main theme of Don Giovanni, is like how women are treated in society based on how they act in terms of the sexual mores of the time. So there's that. Donna Elvira says, you married me and then you left me. And so we hear some of these women's stories, but we never see what actually happens. So it's up to us in the audience to decide what has happened off stage, and sometimes up to production elements. If Donna Anna comes on stage in a ripped costume, right, we're going to think something different has happened than if she looks fine, or if in some productions it tries to make the interaction more consensual. So she's saying, the words she says in the opening scene are, I won't let you get away. Meaning, like, I'm going to, she says, like a fury, I'm going to pursue you, like, you've done something terrible to me, therefore I'm going to hold on to you so you can get justice, is the subtext. But some people interpret it as, I won't let you go. Yeah. So a lot of those kinds of things are the main things. Yeah, so we're gonna have to stop now, but thank you all for your attention and your participation, and again, we'll stick around if you want to chat with us more. And I hope you'll come to our future events surrounding Don Giovanni and come to the opera. Thank you all.